It is said that shortly before the destruction of Atlantis, one of its wise men climbed a high hill in the heart of the island. He took with him a bowl of water from a sacred spring and a piece of orichalcum, a rare metal that shone like the sun. He knew the end was near. But standing in silence, he said, "Let the earth disappear, but not the memory. Let salt preserve not only fish, but also knowledge." Since then, everyone who seeks the truth about the sunken kingdom, as if he hears echoes of his words, in the rustle of the surf, in the dust of ancient scrolls, in his own dreams. Greetings, my dear friends. Welcome to our cozy lecture before bedtime. Here, in this quiet space where reality blurs slightly, where the mind relaxes and the imagination spreads its wings, we will explore one of the most fascinating mysteries of human history today. Today, we're going to talk about Atlantis, about that very vanished island continent, which, according to Plato, plunged into the abyss of the sea overnight. But did Atlantis really exist? We will look at how this state was organized, its religion, politics, social order, and even its external expansion. We will trace the path of this idea, from Plato's philosophical dialogues to the archaeological hypotheses of the 20th century. We will touch on magic and myths, but we will not let go of the thread of facts. Facts? Do we even have any facts regarding Atlantis? And doesn't the title itself, The Story of Atlantis, seem like a challenge to common sense? If, after listening to this lecture to the end, you do not agree that Atlantis really existed, you will at least feel you have faced a hypothesis worthy of attention. This lecture is not just a bedtime story. It is a serious study in a soft, meditative wrapper. We will analyze the economy of Atlantis, mythological foundations, and archaeological versions. We will study the structure of the state, try to understand the thinking of its inhabitants, and unravel why this island, if there really was one, disappeared. This lecture will do for those who like to fall asleep to a thought-provoking voice, for those who seek tranquility but not boredom, to those who are fascinated by antiquities, myths, and the great mysteries of human history. So make yourself comfortable, wrap yourself in plaid, and close your eyes. Let the lights of the day's worries and the noise of the outside world in your head go out one by one. There will remain only a voice coming through the centuries, and the waves that carry us further and further away. Now, let's start at the beginning. We will be transported to a time when philosophy was just learning to walk, when truth was born in conversations and stories were passed on orally, from elder to youth, from sage to disciple. At the center of this story is Plato. It was he who first mentioned Atlantis. But what did he actually say? And why did the Egyptian priest tell the Greeks this legend? Let's deal with it, and we'll start with the first chapter. Plato's written testimony. How the idea of Atlantis was born, and whether it can be considered true, or whether it was a philosophical dream. Plato's written testimony. At the heart of every great legend is an original source, and if Atlantis is a myth that merges dream and history, archetype and hypothesis, then Plato is the one who first brought it out of the fog of legend into the clear light of the word. He is not only the philosopher and disciple of Socrates, he is not just the man who laid the foundations of European thought. Plato is the chronicler of the shadow, who gave myth form, date and place. His voice is the first to tell the world about Atlantis, and so it is with him that we must begin. The story of Atlantis appears in two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. But to understand what these texts are, you need to know. Plato wrote in the form of philosophical conversations. His characters, real and fictional persons, discuss the structure of the world, the nature of man, truth and falsehood. Plato's dialogues are a theatre of ideas, where each character plays the role of a carrier of a certain thought. And so, in one of these dialogues, the Timaeus, we hear an amazing story. It involves Socrates, Critias, Timaeus, and Hermocrates. They gather to continue their conversation about what the ideal state should be. But suddenly, Critias says that he knows more than just a fictional model. He remembers the real history of a great nation that lived many millennia before their time, a people who once tried to conquer the world, but were stopped by the brave Athenians, and themselves disappeared into the abyss of the sea. This people are the Atlanteans. Critias tells us that he learned this story from his grandfather, who as a child heard it from Solon himself, one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece. Solon was not only a legislator, but also a traveller. And one day, while travelling to Egypt, he spoke with the priests of the temple of the goddess Neith in the city of Sais. The priests, keepers of the most ancient archives, told him something unusual. They said, "O Greeks, you are children. You have no ancient law, for you forget what you have experienced. But we have in our temples everything that was." The priest told Solon of a vast island lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules, that is, beyond the Mediterranean Sea, in the Atlantic Ocean. This island, Atlantis, was inhabited by a people powerful and sophisticated, whose cities glittered with gold and sang hymns to the gods. The Atlanteans created a great maritime nation, subjugating many lands as far away as Libya and Tyrrhenia. They came with war to Europe and Asia, but were stopped by the Athenians, the only ones who stood up to them without fear. And soon afterward the gods, angered by the pride of the Atlanteans, brought calamities. One terrible day and night the island fell into the abyss, disappearing into the abyss of the sea. The ocean in its place became impassable, full of silt and mud. Plato even gives the exact date. All this happened 9,000 years before Solon. This is about 9,600 BC, that is, long before any known civilization. The date raises doubts among modern scientists, but it gives the story scale and seriousness. This is not just a fairy tale. It's a parable put into precise forms. Atlantis has geography, politics, religion, and tragedy. It has architecture, ships, walls, palaces. It has a beginning and an end. But how should this story be understood? For centuries, scholars have debated whether Plato considered the story of Atlantis a historical fact or merely an allegory. Was it a lesson in pride and moral decline, or an attempt to preserve the memory of a real catastrophe experienced by mankind in time immemorial? Lewis Spence, author of the book on which we are basing this, believes Plato took the story seriously. His appeal to Egyptian sources is not a literary device, but a sign of respect for an older tradition. Egypt, in the eyes of the Greeks, was a land of sages and archives, and if the Egyptian priest spoke of a sunken continent, then it was not fiction, but knowledge that had survived through the ages. Plato does not describe Atlantis as something ephemeral. He speaks of the exact size of the island, of its circular canals and centers of power, of kings, of Poseidon's altars, of alliances and laws. It is as if he were conveying a report rather than a fantasy. It is a story in which every word may be a clue, every image a reflection of reality. There is not a note of irony in his dialogue. There is excitement, there is seriousness, there is confidence. Of course, Plato's style is artistic, in some places sublime. But this is not a sign of fiction, but a way of communicating with the reader of his time. He creates not a myth, but a mytho-historical narrative to convey truth through beauty. From this point of view, Atlantis is not just an island. It's a symbol of a civilization that rose too high and was swept away. It's a warning, but it is also a trace of the past, a shard of knowledge that Plato tried to bring back to mankind. This is where the journey of Atlantis begins, from the mouth of an Egyptian priest, through Solon, through Critias, through a philosophical text. We see how legend becomes narrative, and narrative becomes an invitation to explore. And now that we have heard Plato's voice, it is worth asking the question, was he alone? After all, if others followed him, if they too heard the echo of the sunken world, then this echo is not accidental. In the next chapter, we will look together at the writings of historians and geographers who lived after Plato. Which of them believed in Atlantis? Who tried to find traces of it? And how did the view of this vanished world change over time? Sources after Plato. When Plato first told the world about Atlantis, his words echoed through philosophical schools, scholars' houses, and temples where ancient legends were preserved. But this echo did not fade. It continued to resound. For centuries, passing through the minds of historians, geographers, poets, the question of the sunken civilization was not closed within the framework of a single dialogue. It became a topic of discussion for many thinkers who wrote after Plato. Some repeated his story almost verbatim. Some fitted it into the larger picture of myths and cosmogonies. There were those who doubted, who sought proof, or sought to find hidden meaning in the legend. But the very fact was that Atlantis had not disappeared, at least from human memory. One of the earliest to pick up Plato's thread was Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian of the 1st century BC. His major work, the Historical Library, is an attempt to compile the entire history of mankind from the earliest times to its present. He does not mention Atlantis directly, but describes the people who lived outside the oikumene, the inhabited part of the world at that time. These peoples lived in the Western Islands, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and were, he says, advanced, skillful in navigation, and possessed special knowledge. Is this a coincidence, or a cautious attempt to talk about Atlantis without entering into an argument with Plato's critics? Diodorus wrote that in the Atlantic Ocean there are numerous islands rich in flora and fauna, and that in ancient times seafarers came from there and traded with other peoples and brought with them unusual goods and stories. Such phrases sound like a faint reflection of the vivid description that Plato gives. And yet, they are there, they exist. So the story did not die with the author. Following Diodorus, Pomponius Mela, a Roman geographer of the 1st century AD, addresses the subject. His De Chorographia is one of the earliest surviving geographical works of the Latin world. He creates a map on which he points out the existence of unknown lands beyond the known seas. There, among the white spots and unexplored expanses, he places certain western islands. Their descriptions are vague, but their very existence fits into the context of Plato's Atlantis. Pomponius does not refer directly to Plato, but his approach is a reflection of the world view of the era. If the world is great and unexplored, then legends like Atlantis have a right to exist. He speaks of an ocean full of mystery and enigma, about a place where unusual peoples live, where islands appear and disappear, where gods once lived among people. This image of the Atlantic is something between scientific hypothesis and mythological knowledge. It is no longer just philosophy, but geographical curiosity bordering on faith. Special attention should be paid to Strabo, an eminent Greek geographer who lived between the 63rd year BC and the 24th year AD. His work Geography became one of the most influential encyclopedias of the ancient world. Strabo mentions Atlantis more as a rumor, a legend passed down from other authors. He himself is skeptical, but not categorical. He writes about the possibility of lands that may have been submerged. He reflects on the mobility of the Earth's crust, on the role of earthquakes and floods in changing the appearance of the Earth. For Strabo, it is important not to confirm the myth, but to assess its probability. He analyzes ancient texts, compares geographical data, and concludes that much has yet to be discovered. Much may be hidden beneath the layers of time. His scientific skepticism does not deny the myth, but seeks to place it within the realm of the probable. Against the background of these serious voices, there are also more fabulous ones. The writings of ancient authors mention the Amazons, Gorgons, peoples living at the edge of the world, in a country called Marina. These legends are woven into the general pattern of mythology, where Atlantis is only one of the brightest fragments. The country of Marina, according to the descriptions, was far to the west, where the sun goes below the horizon. Women warriors lived there, monsters dwelt there, and strange phenomena occurred there. Is this an echo of Plato's story? Maybe. Or maybe it is the same song, but in a different language. It is important to realize that in antiquity, myth and history were not opposites. They were ways of describing reality. Myth spoke of what was forgotten but not lost. History was about what was recorded but not always understood. And Atlantis existed at the intersection of these two paths. Not all thinkers believed in its existence. Some considered Plato's story an allegory, others an untold truth. But the idea of Atlantis lived on. It inspired, caused disputes, and did not let go of minds. And now a new question arises before us. If we have already listened to Plato and his continuators, what can the modern view say? What can the method of research, analysis, comparisons give us? Where to look for Atlantis, if not in words, then perhaps in the traces left in landscape, culture, genetics. In the next chapter, we will step beyond the threshold of legend and open the doors of scientific approach. We will try to understand what ways we can get closer to the truth, and whether there is a chance that Atlantis was a reality that we have almost lost but can still recognize anew. a study of historical sources. They say time is the best destroyer. It erases not only footprints in the sand, but also walls, books, entire cities. And if Atlantis really existed, then waiting for direct evidence of it is like looking for a preserved petal at the bottom of a volcano. But does that mean we shouldn't look? On the contrary, if this legend has survived the centuries and reached us, we must try. But we will have to look not for direct evidence, but for indirect evidence. We will work as archaeologists of consciousness, looking into myths, comparing cultures, studying shapes, sounds, symbols. We will not look for Atlantis itself, but for the shadow it may have cast on the shores of history. Lewis Spence wrote, "Is it reasonable to expect direct documentary evidence concerning a civilization that completely disappeared over 11,000 years ago?" And answered, no. But we can prove its existence by other means. In this chapter, we will consider together what those means are. The first thing that comes to mind is archaeology. If Atlantis was a real civilization, there must be some traces left behind, right? Temples, buildings, canals, pottery, tools. But it's not so simple here. The problem is that, according to Plato, the island continent disappeared overnight. Earthquakes, floods. It's not just a catastrophe, it's total destruction. If the island has gone underwater, there is nothing for an archaeologist to do there. What might have been found is either buried under layers of silt or has long since been destroyed. The ocean is not a library. It doesn't store, it absorbs. And yet, even underwater, people find mysterious shapes, underwater structures that resemble ruins. The scientific and near-scientific environment describes finds in the Atlantic Ocean, flooded plains, strange platforms. Off the coast of Bimini, amidst the azure waters of the Bahamas, a strange rocky ridge stretches across the seabed. It is neither a coral reef nor a natural deposit. Like an ancient road, it is laid out of large rectangular slabs, as if someone once paved a way into the depths. Its length is about 700 meters. Some are sure that this is just a limestone platform that has weathered. Others believe it's the remains of an artificial structure. It is interesting that it was here, in the direction for Hercules' pillars, that Plato pointed. And although the age is estimated at 2,000 to 3,000 years, much younger than the alleged Atlantis, geography and scale suggestive. Could this be just the tip left of something much older, hidden deeper beneath the layers of time? Far to the southwest, between Cuba and Yucatan, another mystery lurks. At a depth of more than 600 meters, sonars once recorded regular geometric formations, platforms, rectangular shapes, possible outlines of pyramids. The water there is silent, but its stillness holds a mystery. If these objects do lie at this depth, it means that they existed before the ocean rose after the last glaciation. That is, before the very time Plato referred to. There is little confirmation, even less research, but the very location, in the heart of the Atlantic region, makes this one of the most intriguing finds. Of course, none of these places can be called Atlantis with full confidence. Not a single slab at Bimini, not a single silt-filled foundation at Cuba contains the inscription, "Atlanteans lived here." But they are all echoes, traces. Perhaps they are not ruins of one country, but fragments of a common cultural layer that once covered the shores of the oceans. The next path is geography and geology. The Earth is changing. Continents drift. Mountains grow and islands sink. Scientists have long studied tectonic processes, and many of them agree that 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, the climate changed dramatically. It was the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose, flooding coastal areas. Entire areas went underwater. Examples include the Sahara, which was once green, the English Channel, which was dry land, the coasts of Japan, where underwater terraces have been discovered. Perhaps Atlantis is not one island, but a whole region, part of which went underwater, part of which remained, but changed beyond recognition. A place between Europe and America, between North and South, where cultures, waters, tribes collided. If such an area existed, it could be the cradle of many peoples. And if we see similarities in the legends of different continents, then maybe it is not a coincidence, but a consequence of a common history. Here we come to ethnology. This is the science of peoples, their culture, customs, and language. And here is what is interesting. Many peoples have legends about the land that went underwater. The Mayans and Aztecs have Aztlan. The Basques have Ibar. The Celts have Avalon. The African tribes have a land that sank as punishment. Even the people of Polynesia have stories of a great island destroyed by a storm. One could, of course, say that the fear of water is an archetype, that every culture has a flood myth. But then, why do so many of these myths share commonalities? Advanced civilization, hubris, anger of the gods, destruction, and memory. Sometimes even the names are similar. Sometimes the rituals. Sometimes songs. Some researchers draw attention to cultural parallels. They say that if we find traditions, rituals, and architectural forms in distant parts of the world that cannot be explained by local development, perhaps they have a common origin. The so-called Atlantis complex, a set of cultural elements from astronomical knowledge to the cult of water, is repeated in different regions, but has no obvious source. For example, the pyramids, Egypt, Mesoamerica, even China. Why did such different peoples come up with the same architectural form? Why is the idea of flood, purification, sacrifice repeated in rituals? Why are the images of snakes, the sun, the great ocean so universal? One of the hypotheses says that in ancient times there was a civilization that gave rise to these cultural motifs. And although it has disappeared, its trace remains in symbols, in rituals, in genetic memory. It's not evidence, but it is evidence. And if there is a lot of evidence, and it fits together, and it adds up to a logical picture, why not take it seriously? The research approach in this case is a bridge between science and myth, not a rejection of logic, but not blind faith either. Myth can be a story that survives history itself. The word can be a witness if there was no writing. And the task of the researcher is not only to reject the impossible, but also to ask, what if? If we have already accepted that Atlantis may have existed, then the next step is to find its location. What do the geographical facts say? How can we find a vanished land on a map? The geography of Atlantis. If Atlantis really existed, it must have had a place, its shape, its territory. Geography isn't just a backdrop for a legend. It's the key. Because every word of Plato, every mention of ancient maps, every hypothesis about the sunken continent begins with one question. Where was she? Plato claimed that Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules. This expression for the ancient Greeks meant the end of the known world, the Strait of Gibraltar, the gate separating the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic. Beyond them began the unknown world, full of fog and danger. And it is there that he places a huge island, larger than Libya and Asia combined, that prospered and then disappeared in one night and one day. That is why the most logical and the first version is considered the location of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean. Old nautical charts, up to the 18th century, depicted strange shapes in this area. Islands that do not exist, outlines that do not exist. Of particular interest is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a giant underwater mountain system running from Iceland to the South Atlantic. Some parts of the ridge barely protrude from the water, like the Azores. This place is being studied with special attention. There are suggestions that in the distant past, there may have been a large landmass here, partially submerged as a result of geological shifts and climatic catastrophes. There is a hypothesis that Atlantis could have been part of the Azores Plateau, a huge tectonic platform lying right in the middle of the Atlantic. Today, the Azores are just the tops of mountain peaks. But what if in the past they were the center of a large archipelago, or even a continent? Ocean levels have risen more than 100 meters in the last 12,000 years. What was dry land in 9,600 BC today may lie at the bottom. But there are other theories. For example, the Sahara Desert. It seems impossible that one of the driest regions on the planet could be linked to a maritime legend. However, on ancient maps, on the border of today's Mauritania, there is an unusual geological formation, the structure of Rishat, or the Eye of the Sahara. From the air, it looks like giant concentric rings, almost perfectly matching the description of the capital of Atlantis. Surrounded by circular canals and waterways, although the region is dry today, research shows that in deep antiquity there were rivers, lakes, and a humid climate. Water that's gone, and perhaps with it, a whole story. There are also theories linking Atlantis to the coasts of Spain and Portugal, the Canary Islands, the Caribbean, and even southern Greenland. What all of these sites have in common is that they lie within or near the Atlantic zone, are in areas of tectonic activity, and some of them are still not fully explored. Some archaeologists believe that signs of a vanished civilization should be sought precisely where continental plates collide, where the land can suddenly rise or sink to the bottom. But if geography is a map, then maps are also memory. There are evidences that are not so easy to explain. For example, Piri Reis's map from 1513. It shows the coasts of South America, Africa, and Antarctica. Or rather, its shape under the ice. Ice appeared there, as we know, thousands of years ago. How could the author of the map know the shape of the continent, which we discovered only in the 20th century, with the help of satellites and echolocation? There are no answers, but the map exists, and it's not the only one. There is also a map by Orontius Phineas, 1531, that shows lands in the South Atlantic area that are not on modern maps. On ancient globes, there are designations Antilia and Atlantis, islands that have disappeared or not discovered. Yes, perhaps these are cartographers' fantasies, errors, or reinterpretations of information. But why do fantasies so often coincide with the same point on the map? Some references are also found in the chronicles of travelers. There are texts that tell of a land beyond the sea from where the first knowledge came, the island of the sun that disappeared under the sea, about inhabitants who sailed the seas but disappeared without a trace. These are all scattered, faint traces, but if you overlay them on a map, you get a direction. And that's what we're going to explore next. In the next chapter, we will turn our attention to the description of Atlantis itself, its organization, structure, ring canals, agriculture, palaces and temples. After all, if the island really existed, its geography was not just a point on the map, but a whole world. The races of Atlantis. Every civilization begins with man. Those who built walls, worshipped gods, waged wars, and made alliances. Who were these people who inhabited Atlantis? What did they look like? What customs did they practice? And are there any traces of their blood, language, or culture left in a world where everything has long since been erased by the winds of time? Plato gives a little information about the race of the Atlanteans. In his account, they are the descendants of Poseidon and the mortal woman Cleito. Their first capital was situated on a hill surrounded by rings of water and land. Poseidon divided the island among his sons, and the ruling dynasty, according to Plato, kept the divine part. But over time, this divine part in them began to weaken, giving way to human nature. They became greedy, proud, ambitious. And then, as the philosopher said, the gods decided to punish them. However, if we go beyond the Platonic text, a broader image can be found. Researchers who have studied myths, folklore, and archaeological data suggest that the Atlanteans could have been a special race, not only in the sense of ethnicity, but also in the sense of culture. People united by special knowledge, level of organization, world view. Some descriptions attribute to them tall stature, fair skin, hair the color of copper or gold, and even an unusual skull shape. In the legends of the peoples of the Americas, especially the Maya, Inca, and Hopi, there are images of teachers who came from the East, tall, bearded, white-skinned, who were later associated with Quetzalcoatl or Viracocha. These figures differed sharply from the appearance of the indigenous population and brought with them knowledge, writing, counting, construction, astronomy. Similar legends exist in Europe. The Celts are the Tuatha De Danann, a divine people who came from the west in luminous ships and possessed magic and knowledge. The Basques have Euskara, an ancient language unrelated to any other in Europe. Some believe it may be a linguistic echo of a vanished culture. Basque genetics also stand out. They have one of the highest percentages of haplogroup R1b in the world, and it is also prevalent on the west coast of Europe, in the Atlantic range. Linguistically, some strange convergences are found in these regions. For example, the language of the Guanches, the indigenous population of the Canary Islands, still retains words that have no analogues in Arabic, Berber, or European languages. The Guanches, tall, fair-skinned, blue-eyed, lived on islands that, according to legend, were left over from a dead continent. Genetics is giving us more and more clues. In recent decades, ancient DNA samples from areas that may have been part of Atlantis' zone of influence have been studied. In the west of Europe, in North Africa, in the Canaries, In the Andes, common elements have been found. They cannot be directly attributed to one race, but they suggest that there was once a cultural and possibly biological exchange between these regions. Thus, the Atlantean race is not just a forgotten nation. They may be the ancestors or relatives of what we today consider to be the peoples of the West. Those who carried into history the seeds of knowledge, architecture, astronomy, the veneration of water and the sun. Their language is gone, but may have left roots. Their faces erased, but perhaps peering back at us from ancient frescoes. Their bodies have faded into the abyss, but their genes have not. In the next chapter, we will try to understand how Atlantis lived, not just who, but how they built, how they believed, how they ruled. Because a people is not just a look, it is the world it believes in and the house it builds. The legend of the origin of Atlantis. Before we can understand how the city was organized, how the canals flowed, and how the temple dome shone, we must return to the very first point, where not the blueprint begins, but the myth, because it is myth that lays the code of civilization. And in the case of Atlantis, it all starts with Poseidon. Yeah, it's mythology in its purest form, a god in love with a mortal, rings of water and earth, drawn by the hand of a deity, 10 sons dividing the island amongst themselves, but the form aside, the essence remains. This is the story of how order triumphs over chaos, how power comes with blessing, how ritual becomes the foundation of law. It may not be fact, but it is truth preserved in symbol. According to Plato, it was Poseidon who became the progenitor of the Atlanteans. On a hillside, amidst the storms of the ocean, he found Cleito, a mortal woman whose soul shone like the dawn. To protect her, he surrounded her dwelling with rings of land and water, and so laid the first structure of the future capital. From their union were born 10 sons. Each got a part of the island, but the firstborn son, Atlas, whose name became the name of the entire nation, was given the supremacy. He became the symbol of stability, and from his descendants began a dynasty of great kings. These 10 rulers were not feuding. They came together on a fixed date, made sacrifices, and drank from a bowl of bull's blood mixed with wine and water. It was a sacred union, not only tribal, but ideological. They were not just heirs, they were pillars of order. The main temple of Poseidon stood in the heart of the capital. It was lined with orichalcum, shone in the light of the moon, and contained not only the statue of the god, but also laws, treaties, and symbols of power. Everything here was a reminder that power was a duty, not a privilege. So Atlantis was born, not out of war, not out of conquest, but out of union, a union between the earthly and the heavenly, between God and woman, between 10 brothers. This structure is no longer just a myth. It is a philosophy, an architecture, a model of the state. The spirit of Atlantis was laid here, in this image of a father guarding love, this circle of sons, not arguing, but swearing. It was from here that the city grew, where everything was laid out like a mandala. Now that we have seen what Atlantis was born out of, we are ready to ask the main question. What level of civilization did its inhabitants possess? How far did they go in technology, culture, science? Level of technology development. Looking at Plato's descriptions, it is hard to believe that we are talking about a time that by modern standards could be called the Stone Age. about 9600 BC, is an era when in other parts of the planet people lived in caves, hunted mammoths, and were just beginning to domesticate animals. But Atlantis, according to the same descriptions, already had ring canals, paved roads, temples, palaces, and metallurgical production. How is that possible? The answer may lie in a special path of development. Atlantis did not follow the same stages of evolution as the rest of the world. It was as if it received impulse, acceleration, from gods, from ancient star teachers, or from special natural conditions that allowed to develop crafts and technologies long before its neighbors. It was as if it lived in the future, inside the distant past. The technological level of Atlantis is admirable. The construction of gigantic structures, without cranes and concrete, but with such a calculation that everything could withstand centuries. Precision stone laying, columns inscribed in lines of light, temples with perfect acoustics, and water systems that regulated pressure and distributed moisture to the terraces. Tools, researchers speculate, included not only stone and copper chisels and hammers, but also devices for drilling, grinding, and polishing. Some suggest the existence of a technique based on sound or vibration as a way to work the hardest rocks. There is indirect evidence for this. In ancient structures around the world, there are holes, grooves, and recesses that could not have been created by brute force. The central place in the metallurgy of Atlantis was occupied by orichalcum. Plato mentions this metal as the second most valuable after gold. It was mined on the island and was used to decorate temples and walls. It is believed that orichalcum could have been an alloy of copper with zinc, tin, or even unknown elements. It had a special luster, reddish golden, as if it absorbed sunlight. It was used not only as jewelry, it was a symbol of power, an amulet of protection. Perhaps the Atlanteans believed that orichalcum resonated with the Earth's energy field and served to protect or enhance rituals. In addition to orichalcum, the Atlanteans apparently had knowledge of copper, bronze, natural glass, and even ceramics with special coatings. Some researchers comparing artifacts from Crete and Santorini find parallels, fine metalwork, jewelry, patterns in the form of waves and spirals, technical elements like drainage systems and clay pipes. These coincidences may suggest cultural continuity, or that the Minoans inherited something from an even older civilization. The parallels with Egypt are also surprising. The Egyptian pyramids, whose age is still debated, were built with a precision that is difficult to replicate, even by modern means. Some theories suggest that the architects of ancient Egypt may have been descendants of the surviving Atlanteans or carriers of their tradition. And indeed, in both cultures, we see the cult of water, knowledge of geometry, connection with astronomy, orientation of buildings according to the stars. Magic and crafts were inseparable in Atlantis. The priest did not only pray, he knew the composition of metals, knew how to control the flow of water, grew plants, collected crystals. Magic was not the opposite of science. It was its deepest foundation. It was a system in which each craft carried a sacred essence. The carpenter knew the proportions of the golden ratio, the stone craftsman the rhythm of the breathing of the rocks. All actions were a ritual, and the result was a reflection of the inner world. If Atlantis was indeed like this, then we have before us an example of a civilization that united the physical and spiritual, the practical and the mystical. The Stone Age here was not an age of limitations, but a time of high knowledge. The political system and life of Atlantis. The political system of Atlantis, as Plato portrays it, was not just an administrative construct. It was a living organism, organized into 10 districts, each ruled by one of Poseidon's descendants. These 10 kings were not equal in power, but were equal in honor. The eldest ruled over all, but not as a despot, but as the first among equals, recognized by the others for his wisdom, seniority, and connection to the lineage of his divine father. Each kingdom had its own capital, its own administrative center, its own specifics. Somewhere artisans prevailed, somewhere military garrisons prevailed, somewhere fields and vineyards stretched to the horizon. Atlanteans understood. Balance is not in identity, but in difference. Some districts supplied grain, others ships, others architects, others philosophers and priests. It was a union in which all parts were as necessary as the organs of the body. The meetings of the rulers were held in the central temple on a strictly fixed day when the stars occupied a special position. The atmosphere of these meetings was ritualistic rather than formal. Before beginning, each made a sacrifice, drank from a sacred cup, and only then proceeded to discussion. Decisions were unanimous. Authority rested on trust, not fear. The law was not an external framework, but an inner core to which everyone voluntarily aspired. The Atlantis Code of Laws was not just a list of prohibitions and punishments. It was a philosophical text in which every rule was based on the idea of harmony. For example, trade between districts was regulated not by tariffs, but by measures of abundance and want. If one district had an oversupply, it was obliged to share it with the one that had a bad harvest. Family alliances between the noble families of the districts were controlled by a council of priests, so as not to upset the balance of bloodlines and prevent the strengthening of one dynasty at the expense of another. Even the punishments had a corrective rather than punitive function. The perpetrator could be temporarily deprived of participation in temple rituals, which was considered a grave disgrace, and only in extreme cases isolation was used. Exile outside the ring city in remote lands, where a person was deprived of contact with the heart of civilization. The religious life of Atlantis, like everything else, was subordinated to the idea of order. The main deity was Poseidon, but he wasn't worshipped in fear as an angry ruler. He was seen as a father, a protector, an architect of the world. Poseidon's temples were not castles, but luminaries. Their walls did not threaten, but glowed mutedly. Altars were decorated with sea stones, coral, bowls of water and salt. Fire and water met here in a ritual dance of elements. The main festivals coincided with astronomical cycles. On the days of the equinoxes, purification rites were held. Atlanteans sank into sacred springs, burned fires on terraces, brought fruits, flowers, fish, and wine. Choirs sang, meditated on the image of waves and spirals as a symbol of the endless movement of life. Inside the temples there were relics, rods made of orichalcum, vessels with water from the original source, mirrors in which, according to legend, one could see the face of one's ancestor. There was also a special language of rituals, not verbal, but gesture and sound. Subtle flutes, long shells, percussive rhythms. All this was not just music, but a vibration that tuned the city to a single resonance. Each temple had a different tone, one for peace, one for vigor, one for purification. The Atlanteans believed harmony within begins with harmony of sound and light around. The philosophy of Atlantis' governance was based on the idea of man's dual nature, earthly and heavenly. Power was only a form of service. The king was not considered more important than others, but more responsible. He was trained from childhood, not only in strategy, but also in poetry, astronomy, gymnastics, meditation. He was to be not only a leader, but also a model. He was not expected to give orders, but to lead by example. The streets of Atlantis reflected this arrangement. In the morning, silence interrupted by birdsong and the hum of the marketplace. In the afternoon, the hum of workshops, the clang of hammers, the noise of canals. By evening, the lights, the music, the smell of baked goods and spicy incense. Everything in the city was proportionate. The width of the streets, the height of the buildings, the color of the facades. The space neither pressed nor lost itself. It maintained a balance. This is how Atlantis breathed, in the rhythm of the stars, in the beat of time, in the spirit of measure. And this very spirit, perhaps, was the most fragile part of the great state, because if it gets loose, the whole structure starts to vibrate. And what happens when the sacred rhythm is broken? We'll talk about that in the next chapter. The fall of Atlantis. Fall doesn't start with disaster. It begins with silence, a faint crack that appears not in the wall, but in the heart. And if a civilization truly has a soul, its demise is not just a destruction, but a betrayal of what made it great. Atlantis had a spirit. There was a code. There was a divine part. And it was the loss of that part that was the beginning of the end. Plato doesn't just report that Atlantis perished. He writes why. And his explanation sounds not like a chronicle, but like a moral diagnosis. In Critias, the philosopher emphasizes the Atlanteans were once half divine. Their lineage went back to Poseidon, and this meant not just descent, but participation in a higher design. But as time passed, the divine part in them weakened. Human nature took over. They began to forget where they came from, and they forgot why they lived. Their hearts were filled with greed, arrogance, and the desire for power. Their abundance became an occasion for pride. Their cities shone not as temples, but as shop windows. Their rituals became empty. Plato is blunt. They had lost their measure, and with it, the blessing. And then, he writes, Zeus, the father of the gods, seeing this, called an assembly of immortals. He wanted to punish them, so that they would once again come into harmony with nature. But that's where the text stops. We don't hear the words of Zeus. We don't see the punishment itself. We see only the result. Atlantis disappears in one night and one day, swallowed up by earthquake, storm, and sea. It's as if the earth itself rejected her. The myth paints the destruction of Atlantis as an act of heavenly judgment. The council of the gods, the wrath of the elements, just punishment, the flood as an archetype, earthquakes as a metaphor for the inner fracture, fire and water together, purification. It's not just destruction, it's a reboot, as in the biblical flood, as in the Indian cycles, as in the myths of the Norse peoples. The world must go through destruction to remember who it is. What was wrong? The first generations of kings kept order. The law was alive. Temples were places of power. But then, generation after generation, everything became external. Power was no longer a service. It became an end in itself. Gold, once a symbol of the sun, became a sign of superiority. Canals built for unity became borders. Priests recited prayers, but no longer without faith. Sacrifices were offered according to tradition, not belief. Temples became museums. That's the way it is. Civilization doesn't collapse when the walls crumble. It dies when it no longer makes sense on the inside, and the outside is still shiny. It is at that moment that the fall begins, not the day when the storm comes. It's when the spirit is lost. In the dialogue Timaeus, Plato emphasizes that in the last epoch, Atlantis begins expansion. It wants to conquer the eastern Mediterranean. Among the targets, ancient Athens. But this Athens of Plato's is not the Athens we know historically. It's an ideal, the image of a virtuous society where moderation, honor, respect for the law reigns. It is they who defeat Atlantis, not by numbers, not by force, but by righteousness. It's not just a story. It is an allegory. Spirit triumphs over form. Meaning triumphs over appearance. There are other explanations as well. Historians and geologists give hypotheses that can explain the death of Atlantis by natural means. Earthquakes, volcanic activity, rising ocean levels after the melting of glaciers. Santorini, for example, is a volcano whose eruption destroyed the Minoan culture. Water flooded the coasts. Cities disappeared. Memory remained and transformed into legend. Others point to archaeological finds, submerged plateaus, geometric structures on the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, unusual formations off Bimini. These are all fragments. Fragments, not proof, but hints. The world keeps traces, sometimes deep, sometimes on the surface. But you can only see them if you know how to look, not with your eyes, but with your attention. But perhaps most importantly, even these versions do not contradict Plato. They do not exclude the myth, but only add to its corporeality. Because myth is not a lie. It is a language in which truth speaks to eternity. It is a fabric into which events, images, fears, hopes are woven. Myth is the mirror of culture. And the demise of Atlantis is not about the past. It's about us. It wasn't the sea that killed Atlantis, not a volcano. It wasn't an enemy army. It was oblivion. Oblivion of meaning. Violation of measure. Betrayal of code. Loss of connection to what makes civilization not just a place, but an idea. Which is why Atlantis' demise is not the end. It's a lesson, not a ruin, but a mirror. Because Atlantis can reappear in any society, in any city, in any man. The only question is whether he remembers who he is. And yet, even when she disappeared, she left a trace. Not in sand, but in memory. Not in stone, but in a cultural code. In rituals, symbols, architecture. Phrases that have passed into new nations. We'll see it in the next chapter. The legacy of Atlantis. Atlantis is gone. Its palaces were covered by water, its laws were washed away by time, its gold was scattered by mud. But Atlantis itself didn't disappear. It remains, in echoes, in fragments, in the breath of other cultures, in myths and traditions that wouldn't have come out of nowhere, in the sense that there was once a center, an axis, a light that no longer burns, but still illuminates. What is commonly referred to as the Atlantis complex is not just a set of myths. It is a cultural matrix, a set of customs, symbols, architectural solutions, rituals, views on power, man, and the cosmos. It is a world view that has not been directly preserved, but which has disintegrated into sparks and woven into the fabric of other civilizations. And what is especially important, such a complex in a similar form is not found anywhere else, except for the spaces covering Western Europe, North Africa, and America. From Plato, the path of realization begins. His words about ring cities, Orichalcus, the temple of Poseidon, 10 kings, divided power, allied empire, are not just a philosophical experiment. We see echoes of these images in other peoples. In the Caribbean, myths about the sea people who came from the east and had knowledge of the stars and fire. The Dogon people of West Africa have precise ideas about Sirius and the cyclical nature of time, which came from teachers who came by water. In Central and South America, the memory of white-bearded gods who came from the ocean gave writing, stone cities, and disappeared. In architecture, stepped pyramids, precise orientation according to the stars, symbolism of water and the sun. In rituals, purification rites, worship of the elements, joint meals in honor of ancestors. The language has ancient roots that echo each other, from Basque to Mayan, from Egyptian to Celtic. It's not an accidental resemblance, it's a map, trace, complex. It's not imaginary. It indicates that there was once something in common, something that lived on the shores of the Atlantic, that could build cities, honor space, speak to the earth, and transmit memory not in letters but in meaning. Atlantis may have had colonies, not military bases but points of influence, centers for spreading ideas, wherever they could build on the same principles, from the Pyrenees to Jamaica, from the Sahara to the Amazon. Places where traces can still be found, in legends, in relief lines, in obscure words. Archaeology is silent, but occasionally ajar. Stones at the bottom of the ocean, geometry not explained by erosion, subtleties in stone carving, commonalities in jewelry, kinship in technology. No Atlanteans lived here, inscriptions, but structures, logic, echoes. The myth of the Great Sea People is one of the most enduring myths on the planet. It has no single source, but it repeats itself with remarkable persistence. It repeats like an echo, like a call. And it doesn't matter if it comes from Egypt, Crete, Peru, or Iceland. What matters is that it's alive. Completion. We have completed a great journey. Throughout the lecture, we tried to answer the most important questions. Did Atlantis really exist? What exactly did Plato tell us about it, and why? How was this mysterious island state organized? Why did it disappear, and did it leave a trace? We examined the myth and juxtaposed it with history. We saw how Atlantis grew not only out of fantasy, but also out of cultural memory. We learned that this civilization had a high level of development, a clear structure, a philosophy of power and cult, architecture, technology, and most importantly, an idea. We compared it with other cultures, found parallels and traces, and we realized Atlantis is not just an island, it's an image, a symbol, an archetype. This story concerns us because it is universal. It is about how a great power can be lost not by an external enemy, but by internal neglect. It reminds us that civilization is not built on gold, not on walls, but on measure, on law, on spirit. And yet Atlantis has not disappeared without a trace. Its memory lives on in myths, in culture, in architecture, in symbols, in the legends of peoples who have never heard Plato's name, in people's quest to unite earth and sky, in the search for harmony. May Atlantis not sink again in our dreams. Let it resurface, not as an island, but as an inner reference point, as a reminder that greatness begins with simplicity, with memory, with measure, with faithfulness to ourselves. Now, wrap yourself up warmly, close your eyes, and set out on your journey. Let this night you will dream of ringing canals and shining temples, the scent of Atlantis gardens, and the voice of Poseidon calling from the depths. Good night. May Atlantis be with you. Where silence speaks louder than words. Introduction.